the rich woman heard her husband's phone conversation. Discovering the will, she pretended to be dead. Elizabeth Thompson wakes up in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines and incessant beeping. Unable to move or speak, she discovers a devastating betrayal. Her husband, Richard, is conspiring to take everything she built. With the help of a brave nurse, Elizabeth devises a daring plan to expose the truth. But a disturbing vision reveals even darker secrets. Elizabeth Thompson woke up with a throbbing headache, the constant sound of beeps and machines surrounding her. She tried to open her eyes, but the bright white light of the intensive care unit, ICU, blinded her. Gradually, memories began to return, fragmented and hazy. She remembered leaving for an important meeting, driving on a slippery road because of the rain, and then everything went blank. Now she was there, lying in a hospital bed, unable to move or speak. Time in the ICU seemed endless. Days and nights blended into a whirlwind of sounds and lights. Elizabeth felt trapped in a nightmare where loneliness was her only companion. She was a middle-aged woman, owner of a business empire she had built with much effort and sacrifice. However, all of that seemed distant and insignificant at that moment. Her thoughts were filled with a silent hope that someone would find her there and pull her out of this state. It was on one of those lonely nights that Elizabeth heard something that made her shiver. She was conscious but unable to move when her husband, Richard Thompson, entered the ICU. Elizabeth could hear his voice, though it was muffled by the slightly open door. "Yes, doctor, she's in a vegetative state. There's no chance of recovery," Richard was saying on the phone, his voice cold and emotionless. "I need everything to be ready for me to take full control of the company. The will needs to be read as soon as possible." Elizabeth felt a stab of panic. Richard, her husband of more than 20 years, planned to take control of everything. The word vegetative echoed in her mind. Did he really believe she would never recover? Worse, was he willing to take advantage of the situation to seize all her assets? The love she once felt for Richard now mixed with betrayal and disillusionment. As she listened to Richard discuss the details of the will with the lawyer, Elizabeth realized her life was in danger. If he discovered she was conscious, he might take drastic measures to ensure she never regained her senses. She needed to find a way to protect herself and, at the same time, prevent Richard from destroying everything she had worked for. The silent hope within Elizabeth began to transform into determination. She needed to pretend to be dead, or at least unconscious, until she found a way out of this situation. Every word Richard uttered was a dagger to her heart, but it also fueled her desire to fight. Elizabeth knew that to survive, she would have to be smarter and stronger than ever before. The decision was made. Elizabeth Thompson would pretend to be dead to survive and reclaim everything that was hers. She would use her intelligence and resources to turn the tables and expose Richard. There, in that hospital bed, a new Elizabeth was beginning to emerge, more determined than ever to fight for her life and justice. Elizabeth spent the following days silently planning. She needed to pretend she was unaware of anything while listening to every word Richard said during his visits to the ICU. Her heart beat faster with each conversation, each plan he made. The frustration consumed her, but determination kept her strong. She wouldn't let him win. One day, a young and kind nurse named Sarah came in to check Elizabeth's vital signs. Sarah had gentle eyes and a welcoming smile. Elizabeth saw an opportunity and, with much effort, managed to slightly move her fingers when Sarah held her hand. The nurse looked at her with surprise and concern. "Can you hear me?" Sarah whispered, hoping for a sign. Elizabeth moved her fingers again, trying to convey a message. Sarah understood and discreetly wrote something in her notebook without drawing the attention of other staff. That night, Sarah returned for the night shift and took advantage of a moment when they were alone to approach again. "I'll help you," Sarah said in a barely audible tone. "I'll investigate what's happening and see how I can get you out of here." Sarah's presence brought a glimmer of hope to Elizabeth. Finally, she wasn't alone. With the nurse's help, Elizabeth began outlining a plan to escape the dreadful situation. Meanwhile, Richard continued to visit her, always with his condescending tone and coldly calculated words. It was during one of these visits that Elizabeth heard something that changed everything. Richard was on the phone, apparently discussing the company's future with someone she couldn't identify. However, he mentioned something Elizabeth had never imagined. "Yes, I know the will clause requires her presence for the official reading," Richard said, irritated. "But if I get a medical statement, we can bypass that." Elizabeth felt a wave of despair. If Richard obtained a declaration declaring her incapacitated, he would take control of everything. She needed to act quickly. Using the few moments Sarah could help her, Elizabeth began writing notes with instructions, asking for help from trusted friends outside the hospital. The situation reached a critical point when Sarah, discreetly investigating, discovered that Richard was planning to bribe a doctor to obtain the statement. With this information, Elizabeth knew there was no time left. She and Sarah needed to put the plan into action immediately. That night, while Richard slept at home, Elizabeth was secretly transferred by Sarah to a smaller, more discreet hospital where she could recover safely. The risk was enormous, but it was their only chance. Elizabeth knew her life depended on the success of the plan. The challenge now was to survive, recover her health, and finally confront Richard with all the evidence of his betrayal. Elizabeth was determined to seek justice and ensure her empire remained intact, away from her treacherous husband's grasp. Elizabeth woke up in the new hospital feeling different. The atmosphere was calmer, and the reassuring presence of Sarah by her side gave her a renewed sense of hope. Sarah informed her that she was safe and that the first phase of the plan had been successful. Elizabeth knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in weeks, she felt she had a chance to win this battle. As she recovered, Elizabeth began to remember the events that had led her there. She often thought about the day of the accident. She remembered the cold and rainy morning, the important appointments she had scheduled, and the sense of urgency that made her drive quickly on the wet road. The collision was sudden and brutal, and the last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the glare of headlights. Elizabeth knew she needed concrete evidence to expose Richard. With Sarah's help, she managed to contact her trusted lawyer, Mark Harris, who immediately offered to assist her. Mark began investigating Richard's actions, seeking evidence that could incriminate him. One afternoon, while Mark and Sarah discussed the action plan, Elizabeth received an unexpected visitor. A tall, weary-looking man entered the room, bringing with him an aura of mystery and tension. He introduced himself as Michael, a former employee of the hotel where Elizabeth and Richard had spent their last vacation together. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to talk to you about something very important," said Michael, nervously. "I have visions, and before your accident, I had a vision I needed to share." Elizabeth was intrigued. Michael explained that he had foreseen an accident involving a motorcycle, but his attempt to warn her was ignored. Elizabeth vaguely remembered a man trying to talk to her at the hotel reception, but in the rush, she didn't pay him any attention. Michael then revealed something even more disturbing. He had seen Richard with another woman, discussing plans involving Elizabeth's death. "I know it sounds crazy, but I'm sure of what I saw," said Michael with a sincere look. "Richard was planning something terrible, and I believe your accident wasn't a coincidence." Michael's words echoed in Elizabeth's mind. If what he said was true, then Richard had tried to kill her. The revelation brought a new layer of urgency to Elizabeth's plan. She needed to expose Richard before he tried something again. With Michael's information, Mark obtained phone records and financial transactions linking Richard to a known local criminal. The evidence began to pile up, but a crucial piece was still missing to bring Richard down once and for all. Then, Elizabeth had a risky but potentially effective idea. She decided to confront Richard in his own home, pretending to still be in a coma. With the help of Mark and Sarah, she dressed in a way that made her look frail and sick. The plan was to surprise Richard and force him to confess his crimes. That night, while Richard relaxed in his luxurious living room, Elizabeth was brought to him in a wheelchair. The expression of shock and panic on Richard's face was all she needed to know she was on the right track. "Richard, I know everything," said Elizabeth. her voice firm despite the pain she felt. "I know about the will, your plans to kill me, and I have enough evidence to send you to prison." Richard tried to deny it, but Elizabeth presented a recording that Mark had obtained from one of his incriminating conversations. Richard's facade crumbled, and he finally confessed, begging for mercy. Elizabeth remained strong. She had gone through too much and knew that justice needed to be served. With Richard in custody, Elizabeth began to rebuild her life, focusing on protecting her empire and keeping it away from her treacherous husband's clutches. The news of Richard Thompson's arrest spread quickly, causing a stir in the media and among the company's employees. Elizabeth, now free from her husband's threats, felt a mix of relief and gratitude. She knew she wouldn't have made it without the help of Sarah, Mark, and Michael. They had become her true allies, and she felt eternally grateful for that. With Richard out of the picture, Elizabeth turned her attention to the company. She needed to ensure that the damage caused by Richard's betrayal was repaired, and that the trust of the employees and shareholders was restored. She called for an urgent meeting with the top executives, determined to show that she was still in charge and ready to lead the company to a new level. In the meeting, Elizabeth presented a restructuring plan that involved greater transparency, employee incentives, and a renewed focus on innovation. Her vision and determination inspired the team, and soon everyone was aligned with the new direction she proposed. Elizabeth felt a new energy taking over the company, and for the first time in a long while, she felt that everything would be okay. However, the greatest transformation was yet to come. Throughout the recovery process and the fight against Richard, Elizabeth realized how lonely her life had become. She had always prioritized work, leaving little room for true friendships and meaningful relationships. But now she wanted to change that. Elizabeth began spending more time with Sarah, Mark, and Michael, and these bonds grew stronger. Mark, especially, proved to be invaluable support, not just as a lawyer but as a friend. He had been by her side every step of the way, facing challenges with courage and loyalty. One quiet afternoon, as they walked together in the park, Elizabeth noticed something deeper between them. Mark had always been a discreet and reserved man, but his constant presence and unconditional support had touched Elizabeth in a way she hadn't expected. "Mark, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me," said Elizabeth, holding his hand. "You stood by my side when I needed it most, and that means more than words can express." Mark smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "Elizabeth, you're an incredible woman. It was a privilege to stand by your side on this journey. And I'll be here whenever you need, not just as your lawyer but as your friend," he said, looking deeply into her eyes. Elizabeth felt her heart race. There was something in Mark's eyes she hadn't noticed before, something that spoke of love and devotion. And at that moment, she realized she wasn't alone. She had true friends and perhaps something more with Mark. Over time, Elizabeth and Mark became more than friends. They became partners, sharing not only professional challenges but also personal moments. The love that blossomed between them brought new meaning to Elizabeth's life, which now felt complete and happy. Elizabeth knew there was still much to be done, both in the company and in her personal life. But with Mark by her side and the true friends she had gained, she felt ready to face any challenge the future might bring. Elizabeth was in a meeting with the company's top executives when her phone rang. It was Sarah, with an urgency in her voice that Elizabeth had never heard before. "Elizabeth, you need to come to the hospital immediately," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Michael is here, and he has something important to tell you." Elizabeth felt alarmed. She apologized to the executives and hurried out, heading to the hospital with her heart in her throat. Upon arrival, she found Sarah and Michael in a private room, both with worried expressions. "What's happening?" Elizabeth asked anxiously. Michael looked at her seriously. "Elizabeth, I had another vision," he said in a low voice. "And this time it's about Mark. I saw something you need to know." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. Michael explained that, in his vision, he saw Mark meeting with Richard before the arrest, discussing something in secret. The idea that Mark, her most trusted ally, could be involved with Richard was unimaginable, but the seriousness on Michael's face made her reconsider. "This can't be true," Elizabeth said. trying to process the information. Mark has always been by my side. He helped me bring down Richard. I know, but you need to check this, insisted Michael. I don't want you to get hurt again. With a heavy heart, Elizabeth decided to confront Mark. She needed to know the truth, even if it meant facing another betrayal. That night, when they met at her house, Elizabeth looked into Mark's eyes, seeking an explanation. Mark, I need to ask you something, Elizabeth began, her voice firm but laden with emotion. Did you meet with Richard before the arrest? Were you involved in anything with him? Mark was visibly shaken but didn't try to deny it. Yes, I met with Richard, he admitted, looking down. But not in the way you think. I was trying to get more information to protect you. I needed to ensure we had all the evidence to put him in jail. Elizabeth felt a mixture of relief and confusion. Could she trust him? Mark's words seemed sincere, but doubt lingered. Why didn't you tell me? Elizabeth asked, trying to understand. Because I knew you wouldn't like it, Mark replied, finally looking up to meet her gaze. And I didn't want to cause you more pain, but I would never, ever betray your trust. Elizabeth saw the sincerity in Mark's eyes and slowly felt her defenses drop. The doubt was still there, but the love she felt for him was stronger. I believe you, Mark, Elizabeth said, hugging him. But we need to be completely honest with each other from now on. Mark nodded, promising never to hide anything from her again. The trust between them was restored, and with it, Elizabeth felt a new wave of gratitude and love. With this new perspective, Elizabeth was more determined than ever to move forward. She knew that with Mark by her side and the loyal friends she had made, she could face any adversity. With Richard in prison and the truth finally revealed, Elizabeth felt a huge weight lifted off her shoulders. The company began to thrive under her renewed leadership, and the employees, inspired by her resilience, became even more dedicated to ensuring its continued success. Elizabeth decided to organize a special event to celebrate the company's new phase and the strengthened unity among everyone. She wanted to personally thank each employee for their support and dedication during the difficult times. The party was a success, full of laughter, stories, and a camaraderie that Elizabeth had never experienced before. In her personal life, Elizabeth found a new balance. She and Mark spent more time together, enjoying the little things life had to offer. Walks in the park, quiet dinners, and long conversations became a pleasant and comforting routine. Elizabeth finally felt she was living the life she always wanted, full of love and peace. Sarah and Michael continued to be an important part of her life. Sarah was promoted to a position of trust in the company, and Michael, with his visions and intuitions, helped Elizabeth avoid traps and potential problems. They had become a true family, united by adversity and strengthened by mutual love and respect. On a sunny afternoon, while walking hand in hand with Mark through her garden, Elizabeth reflected on everything that had happened. The journey had been difficult, full of pain and betrayal, but also discoveries and renewal. She learned the value of honesty, true friendship, and unconditional love. You know, Mark, despite everything, I wouldn't change a thing about what happened, said Elizabeth, looking at him with a smile. All of this made me stronger and showed me what really matters in life. Mark smiled back, gently squeezing her hand. And what matters, Elizabeth? Love, honesty, and family, she replied. And I have all of that now. As the sun set on the horizon, Elizabeth felt a deep contentment. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but with Mark by her side and the loyal friends she had made, she was ready to face anything. Life finally seemed to be in the right place, full of peace and optimism. And so, Elizabeth Thompson, a woman who faced betrayal and adversity, found her way back to happiness. She not only rebuilt her life and her company, but also found true love and a new family. And with that, she knew the future would be bright and full of possibilities.